So we have an outstanding panel for you here today, and while they may not possess John Kasich's self-confidence, they more than make up for it by actually answering questions directly. So welcome to my wonderful panel. But I want to begin with a question for all of you, a question about who's in this room. I want to ask you whether you think of yourself primarily as an insider or an outsider. And while you're thinking about that, I want you to do one more thing for me that maybe hasn't been done yet. I want you to take away, turn off, close your technology. There are plenty of people live tweeting this elsewhere for you. We're going to have an intimate conversation about people's stories. If you're very important and you have to use a laptop, please do it in the social media lounge at the back of the room. Let's just be present here today. Even if you run Google or anything important like that, just search yourself. Now back to my question. Are you an insider or an outsider? So I want you to stand out, if you would define yourself foremost as an outsider. Okay? Take your seats, because you don't want to be confused with the next group. Stand up if you consider yourself foremost an insider. And stand up if you refuse to answer questions from moderators. Great. So the official title of this panel is The New American Community. But as I learned more about my brilliant, daring panelists, it occurred to me that in various ways, what they think about is the question of how the boundaries between outsiders and insiders are changing in America, and how the very meaning of American is changing in that process. So it's a panel about power, misfits, outsiders, and who belongs and who doesn't. And naturally, it's in the Ronald Reagan building, that great champion of misfits and outsiders. So I really want to think about, first, this phrase that you all have doubtless heard in the news recently. Hillary Clinton, after an enormous amount of focus grouping, has decided that the winning campaign slogan is Everyday Americans. Everyday Americans. And it's one of those phrases that we're supposed to know what it means. It's supposed to signal something to us, dog whistle something to us. But it seems to me Everyday Americans is a term in flux, actually, and it's changing. So let's just go down the aisle. We're going to start with Linda. I want you to tell me, from where you sit, how is the everyday American changing in a way that the majority of insiders in this room and in this country may not realize?
I focus on class issues. I actually was a night cook at an IHOP until about a year and a half ago. So for me, that definition of everyday is kind of struggling a little bit more to make up for whatever cuts we've just put through, or whatever broad, sweeping, big dream policies that we're talking about, to borrow a phrase from my favorite governor of Ohio. And so for me, it very much is a question of everyday Americans are making up for the decisions that if we're using the insider and outsider phrasing, that the insiders are making. We are the ones that are the cleanup crew, both physically, or literally and figuratively. So.
LZ.
I'm fortunate. I get to spend a great deal of time with students who teach me things every day, and then I get paid for it as if I'm teaching them, which is really cool. When I think about that phrase, I think about a dinner I just had with a group of my students, as well as someone from the Heritage Foundation. And she, more than I, was so surprised to hear the enthusiasm for John Huntsman's campaign in 2012. In fact, when I said, oh, there was one GOP candidate I was really interested in, she literally listed everyone else, including Donald Trump, and had totally forgotten about John Huntsman. And so then I said, well, it was John Huntsman. And then all the students were like, oh, God, I really loved him. And she was completely shocked. And part of the reason why she was shocked was because she didn't realize the true hunger there is for independent thinkers, for someone who could be a third-party representative, for someone who was both socially liberal while being fiscally conservative, and that there were actually a lot of young people who really craved that they weren't really identifying with the extremes that they heard on television, but they were identifying with their friends, and their friends were of this ilk. And so when I think about New America, I think maybe finally we'll get back to what the forefathers talked about, and that is avoiding the dangers of a two-party system. That maybe the things that we saw with Ross Perot and the entertainment of that from the 90s would actually start to really materialize into a movement, and that there will be a legitimate third party. We no longer will be handcuffed to either being this side or this side because there's no room for an organized middle.
Denise.
It's a very interesting question for the group that I work with. I tell the story of 16 million American-born Latinos that have at least one parent from a Spanish-speaking country. And being called American means that they can't be from where their parents are from. And when you consider that where their parents are from and what their homes look like is sort of as much like that homeland as it could possibly look, feel, smell, and sound like, being called American doesn't feel right, even though I am and we are. And it's something that I examine in my work every day with the people that I speak with.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the question of the everyday American is so fascinating, and I'm glad you brought up the John Kasich event before this, because of the many, many sort of enlightening things that have happened here, all the things I've learned, the fact that John Kasich is a Linkin Park fan is definitely that was the most astounding moment.
That is the big takeaway.
It was, I tweeted it because it was such a startling revelation, but it was an interesting moment because it was sort of like a performance of being the everyday American, right? Like, I'm just like you, I'm into popular culture as well. I work primarily as a cultural critic, I also teach, and so like LZ, I love having this access to sort of the tastes and ideas and sort of dynamics of young people. And I think what really fascinates me about this question is, I think what really draws me to culture and thinking about art and thinking about questions that all of the panels have sort of looked at through art is that art seems to be dealing with the contradictions and sort of trying to hold institutions accountable for the promises of diversity and inclusion and things like that. And so there's a lot of contradiction, I think, that everyday Americans and sort of everyday art is working through that I think doesn't always play into these sort of broader scale conversations about these things.
So I want to ask Linda a question about indirectly Downton Abbey, the show Downton Abbey, some of you may watch. When we watch Downton Abbey, it's very clear that that world, that time, that place had a class system.
Right.
And class was not just how much money you had, it was an identity that worked with the amount of money you had. I think most Americans think they don't live in something like that.
That's
Are they wrong?
adorable. It's adorable that most people can think that they don't live in a class system. What we don't have is an aristocracy, which is fine, but when you have those bastions of working class ethos at, what was it, Princeton or Stanford, coming out and saying we're dangerously close to plutocracy, I wonder how far that line of thought's really going to take you. I would say that most workers understand that there is a strong class system in America because, no offense to those of you that actually are insiders, I'm unlikely to ever even have the guts to apply for a grant at any of the institutions you run because they're not for people like me. We go to our local economic development offices if we have entrepreneurial spirit at all, which is, again, I just can't stop mentioning John Kasich. When he talked about cutting economic development and was very proud of that, I thought, well, that's fantastic for folks who can get a bank loan. I got medical debt. So if you want to talk about barriers to entry and you want to talk about Downton Abbey, I see a very clear upstairs, downstairs. But I would agree that most people don't because they are cushioned from that need to see it. And I think that if we want to solve this kind of broadening inequality and this broadening problem that we're starting to talk about more and more frequently, it would probably behoove us to just admit that we have a class system. We have folks that go to university, we have folks that don't, we have folks that are going to be socially mobile, we have folks that aren't, and we know that that comes down to our parent zip codes, it comes down to our skin color, it comes down to our marginalizations. And so to ask somebody from a lower class or a marginalized community, is there a system that oppresses you? I think it's adorable if you can live in this country and think otherwise. And I wish that we had a country in which everybody could think that there wasn't a class system. Unfortunately for now, it's kind of the lucky few that get to feel that way. Unfortunately for us, those are also the people making the policies and distributing the grants and coming up with the programs that the rest of us have to live under, so.
Picking back off what you're talking about, I think part of the reason why we don't register in terms of that we're living this class sort of society is because if you ask someone in the top 5%, they'll tell you that they're middle class.
Right.
And if you talk to someone
In the
say,
bottom
in the
20.
bottom,
Yeah,
they think they're middle class. There's this disconnect between
We have an aspirational class, and then we have like lived class, I think, is really where, yeah.
I want to get both Denise and then Hua on this. There's a national politician of national stature recently accused of being un-American, belonging to more than one society. And it actually wasn't President Obama for once, but Jeb Bush. And there was an attack on Jeb Bush that he was going to be our second un-American president in a row.
They're from Connecticut, right?
Because although born in Connecticut and the son and the brother of presidents, that normally gets you a pretty clear American pass. But that he had, in the terms of this article, chosen, in the choices in his life, to assimilate into a Latin American milieu, and his dream was to make America like Miami.
Wow.
And I was partly depressed by this and partly thought, this is kind of progress that Republicans have someone in their field that someone accused of being un-American. So can you reflect on this idea of multiple belonging? Because it seems like John Huntsman was very proud of speaking Chinese. Jeb Bush is pretty open about, being part of at least two different worlds. Is multiple belonging gaining an acceptability among the people you talk about?
I almost don't know where to begin. I just yesterday, I connected with an old friend that I had done an internship with in 1991 in Detroit, Michigan. And he and I were sharing stories. He's part of this generation of Enyes, and that's N with the tilde. So like X and Y, there's Enyes. And my friend Louis Lopez graduated from Harvard Law School. And he shared with me a story about walking down the street, so excited and proud to have gotten into Harvard, and with his Harvard sweatshirt, and a random gal on the street decides to come up to him and say, "Where did you get that sweatshirt?" And he's like, "What are you talking about? I got it at wherever you buy sweatshirts at Harvard, and wherever the bookstore." And she said, no, I thought my husband had to go to school here for 4 years to get that sweatshirt, and you're telling me that they just give them out to anybody now? And this is what this question reminds me of. This is my life every single day. What I do for a living, all there seems to be is this intolerance for the American side of the Enye, and this okayness with saying these comments. It leaves me speechless, and that it's my work, it's an honor, and it's pervasive, and I'm sure everyone in this room has some version of this story, but I can't even remember the question.
That's good. That was a great story. Well, I'm going to go to you.
Did I answer it?
on the same thought, looking at culture as you do, in pop culture, is multiplicity on the rise in America?
I mean, that's such a huge question, I don't know where to begin, but one thing that I thought about was, I don't know how many of you still watch television, or if you do watch ABC, but ABC is
What is ABC?
television companies used to produce television, right? And ABC...
Like in the boxes?
Yeah.
Right.
And but they've really sort of bought in heavily in this idea that we could have, rather than one market to dominate them all, we could sort of cleave up the market and sort of produce the Asian American show, like the Latino show. There's a way in which there's an interesting experiment being done at ABC. But I'm not sure, it sort of goes back to the original question, I'm not sure what the outcome of all of this is, because I was really sort of shaken recently. I was reading a couple different polls that seemed to contradict each other. One was that sort of millennials are the most sort of politically progressive, most tolerant sort of group of Americans to ever be made. but also that there was a sort of profound disinterest or disbelief in notions of income inequality, which seems to be sort of a contradictory, two contradictory viewpoints to hold. So at times I wonder if 10 years from now, kids grow up watching ABC and seeing sort of different ways of becoming, whether that will actually have a sort of a political or social outcome that actually will address some of these sort of the real issues that the culture merely sort of touches upon.
So LZ, you gave a very widely viewed TED Talk in which you told the story of how a Matthew Broderick movie helped you realize you were gay. So another part of Matthew Broderick's legacy. And you write a lot about the challenge that gay Americans pose to the sports world and the difficulty the sports world has and how that's changing. Can you talk a little bit about how you think the kind of conception of manhood in particular in the sports world is evolving to accommodate kind of new claims?
Well, considering that Bruce Jenner is supposed to, we believe, come out as a transgender individual, I think we have to broaden the conversation out to just, not just in terms of sexual orientation, but gender identity and how that fits in the lexicon of what is considered manly or masculine in the sports world. I am both horrified and amazed at the pace in which, and talking specifically about the professional men's sports, the NFL, the NBA, NHL, and baseball, have sort of engaged in this conversation over the last 3 years. I'm amazed and I'm happy that they seem to be allocating resources to help make the environment a lot more palatable for people to be who they are. With that being said, how many openly gay football, baseball, basketball, or hockey players are there right now in the Big Four leagues? 0. So they've done all of this, work, I guess, and yet there still seems to be a disconnect. And I personally know that there are athletes who are closeted in these leagues, and yet they still don't feel comfortable coming out. So if you look at the narrative—
What do they think would happen?
I honest to God don't know, because I'm sort of confrontational about this. I guess I've been out for a long time. I've been in sports for a long time. I've been called a lot of things for a long time, and yet I still have managed to live. I've still managed to make a living and things like that. And so I get frustrated when I talk to them about this, but there's still like this fear that it would cost them their livelihood. There's this fear that they could lose endorsements. And I will tell you, some of the players that I know that are closeted, they weren't going to be endorsed anyway. And I tell them that to their faces. It's like, you're not that good. Like, you're not going to get a shoe. You're not going to sell orange juice.
Don't blame being gay.
Don't blame the endorsements. It's such a cop-out, But there is legitimate concern that while overtly things are being said to make it seem as if we're all lovey-dovey and huggy-huggy, behind the scenes, there are still some signs there that legitimize their fear of losing their employment. You look at the career arc, or non-career arc, if you will, of Michael Sam. Great story. He's on the cover of everything. He's being awarded for everything the president's calling him, and he's on Dancing with the Stars and still trying to get into the league. So there is legitimacy to that concern, but I always think that the fear of something is much greater than the reality.
Linda, I want to ask you about the idea of choice. I think in a lot of our national political conversations about poverty, the fundamental thing the issue seems to turn on is the question, people are arguing about how much choice do poor people have to get out. And people are disagreeing fundamentally about that pivot point. And so when you hear Governor Kasich saying, well, people get out of jail and they meet the drug dealer on the corner, I mean, a lot of things were missing from that story. The fact that they probably have a felony conviction, the fact that they can't get jobs in public housing. There was a little bit, it was a short story, Twitter length, and it missed a lot of the reasons why people may make the choices they do. Can you talk about what choice looks like for you and for others in the world that you spend a lot of time in?
Sure. So just because it's relevant and topical, you guys, I can't tell you enough how many times they drill into your head relevant and topical when you're learning to give speeches. One of the chapters in my book starts with the sentence, I think I might be a felon. The reason for that is because I lived in Ohio. I was on Medicaid, I was on food stamps. This is because my husband had just come back from Iraq and was meant to get what they call the yellow ribbon benefit. That means that when your GI Bill is paid, they pay your tuition, they pay your housing, they pay your books, and then they give you a stipend to live on based on your zip code. Now, we moved to Cincinnati, I'm pregnant, Tom's going back to school, we're adjusting to being home from Iraq. The money never came through, but somehow the school managed to get paid. We got the books and the tuition, but never any living expenses. So we are in absolute poverty. We had no jobs. I went to a Burger King, picked up half-time. He wound up working full-time while adjusting, coming home from Fallujah with the Marines, by the way, so this is not nothing. And then we had the baby and we moved to Utah. We called the state of Ohio over the course of months and months and said, please stop giving us money. We swear to God, we're poor elsewhere now. Please stop giving us money. But as it turns out, there's only one welfare office for all of Cincinnati. All of Hamilton County has one office with, I think it was 23 caseworkers to deal with that entire needed population. We couldn't get them to stop giving us money. And this is fiscally responsible to begin with. But the law says that if you are on welfare and you do not qualify, you are at fault no matter whether or not you gave clear notice to the state that they should stop giving you money, which means that I have, for the next 4 years, given the statute of limitations, in both the states of Utah and Ohio, any police officer at any time could charge me with a felony for welfare fraud. That is what choice looks like to me. To me, it looks like, well, I'm going to not get arrested unless, of course, a cop decides that I was in Ferguson and said something he didn't like about police officers when I was emotional and kind of, you know, a little head up because I just got tear gassed by my own damn government. You know, if I speak wrong publicly, I am afraid that I might be arrested in 2 American states because we cut welfare admin to save a little bit of money for economic development. That's choice. Choice to me is, do you want to work the morning shift or the night shift? And also, do you want to have a job at all? Which isn't, by the way, a choice. It's a thing they give you that you were lucky to have, and then they say you should probably feel luckier that you have a job at all. And oh, by the way, why aren't you doing better? Because frequently at Burger King, they give us matching tuition funds and good degrees, and then they ship us off to fellowships, because unpaid internships are a thing that we can afford to choose. You want to talk about drug addiction, sweetheart, we don't even go to the doctor. Half of those drug addicts have massive back problems or mental health issues. They are self-medicating. It is a choice for us to not feel abjectly awful at all times. This is why occasionally we buy televisions, and I'm so sorry, you guys. Occasionally I have bought a television in my life while accepting public funds. Because as it turns out, the need for entertainment is a human need. The need for connection is a human need. Maslow has this thing called a hierarchy, and people who are familiar with class should be familiar with hierarchies. You cannot self-actualize when you're still worried about feeding yourself. But you know what's great if you worry about feeding yourself all the damn time? Occasionally watching terrible TV for a couple of hours. Man, that stuff's brainless. It's perfect. And so when we are making choices, we aren't doing it in a vacuum, but we are not given credit for that fact. We are given credit for, well, I mean, you could have gone to Stanford and gotten an internship. Why didn't you just do that? I can't tell you. I speak frequently at universities, at graduate programs now. My author name and my legal name are different. I always apply as an undergrad at the universities that are using my work as canon. I never get an acceptance as an undergrad to those universities. Just FYI, I've been running that experiment for about a year now. So that's my choice.
Wow. Hua, I want to ask you about another group that we can think about, which is young people. One of the things you've spent some time thinking about is how we live in this age where it's easier for anybody to create culture, if Vine videos are culture. And when we look at what young people are creating in any era, it often tells us a lot about what's coming down the road, right? I mean, we could have anticipated the police drug issue 20 years ago if people in power had been listening to hip hop. Can you talk about what you're hearing now from looking at what young people are saying on the edges and what that tells us about where we're headed?
Yeah, I'll try and speak on behalf of young people. Since
Please do.
What's your favorite band?
What?
What's your favorite band?
He's no John Kasich when it comes to
Deadhead, you know. But I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think what's interesting is that notions of like taste and distinction have sort of turned into, like, rather than people having like a favorite band, it's sort of like people are really into like platforms or devices or things like that now. I mean, speaking directly to this question of sort of what we might learn by looking at sort of the edges of the conversation, I mean, it just seems as though for those of us who remember sort of the 90s with any kind of fondness, notions of sort of like the culture wars and the canon wars, I mean, we definitely live in a moment now, and I don't think you need to be young to be able to say that the notion of like a monoculture, the notion of like a single sort of core sort of cultural value or a pop cultural value, or the notion of the single sort of blockbuster is kind of behind us. There's many ways in which one can sort of create art and be successful and have an impact on the margins. But one thing that's interesting, and I don't really quite know what to do with it, is sort of that everything has become terrain for contestation, everything has become a battleground. And I think things like Twitter, Vine, Yik Yak, all sorts of social media applications have really proliferated the ways in which people can sort of debate notions of value and identity. I think that's really powerful. I don't quite know what to do with it sometimes, particularly
when older
campus.
people like me make fun of Vine videos as a cultural form, do you think we are being as naive as like the Pat Robertsons not wanting their kids to go listen to Elvis in the 50s or whatever?
I'm enjoying being sort of like the resident teenager here. So
It's all about
I
that
don't know
good skincare regime you have.
I don't know if people know what Vine is like it's a 6-second loop, right?
Yeah.
6 seconds, 7 seconds?
I'm not
Okay.
sure.
I don't know. I mean, I think what's interesting is, Vine is incredibly popular. It's really popular in certain contexts, particularly in the sporting world. Like I think the NBA, as though it wasn't already incredibly popular, it's even more popular now because of Vine. I think soccer is more popular in the United States because of Vine. I don't know. I mean, I think it's too early to sort of use an old Robertsonian model to understand the import or lack thereof of a lot of these things. Because, Twitter seemed sort of pointless to me when it started, and now it's an essential tool. So, I don't know. It's just hard to use sort of an old media metric to understand the impact of new media.
Denise, I want to ask you about one of the things that is a little bit split personality when we talk about diversity in this country. At one level, even when we talk about immigration, at one level we want immigrants to change us. That's the whole point. We want their hardworking ethic, and we want something that they bring that we maybe don't have already. And we also don't want them to change us at all because we want to keep exactly as we are. When you think about the way in which demographically Latinos will change America demographically over the next few decades, do you think that population will also change America culturally in appreciable ways? And what do you think will be the biggest changes that you anticipate, having gone quite deep and looking in these people's lives?
Sure. I mean, it's happening right now. It's actually really exciting. I just interviewed a gentleman named Sal Cuevas, and Sal Cuevas is like, he's the bass player of every single amazing Latino artist, from Celia Cruz, who's the queen of salsa, all the way to J-Lo and the Estefans. And when we had a conversation, and he's an Enye from the Bronx, just like me, a New Yorican, and he said what his roots were in funk. And when he got a chance to be in the studio with somebody named Willie Colon, he said he was bored of this American way of playing the bass. And so he decided to play it a little bit different. And what happened was everything changed. And if you're into music, you hear Sal, what his contribution to salsa, merengue, all different styles of music, bachata, everything started with this bored New Yorican guy who didn't want to do things the same old way. And forever salsa has changed. Mm-hmm. We see it in music, any kind of fusion music, Afro, Cuban, funk. We see it in food, fusion food. It's happening all around us. And what I imagine and what I hope for is that it'll be distinguished as such, and that's my work, is really recognizing the contribution of the Enye and saying this is a very Enye band, and this is a very Enye contribution, because it only will continue to grow. And but what needs to happen is this group needs to be recognized as a contributing group.
You must encounter people who are very threatened by the people whose stories you're telling, and who are
Absolutely.
threatened by how many more of them there will be in the year 2045 than now. How do you best and most empathetically understand those people?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I'm Puerto Rican and Cuban, and I have a very, to some people, non-stereotypical look to me. And in some circles, I look very Puerto Rican. But the part of me that doesn't has found myself, unfortunately, in the presence of people who don't think that I am, and I end up hearing a lot of interesting comments. And
You're like an undercover racism agent.
right.
See, that's TV programming I watch.
Anybody from ABC here?
So I'm sorry, what was the question again?
How do you understand, if you have to be as empathetic to the people who are on the fear side, frankly?
Sure. Well, I guess for the longest time, I didn't say anything. So I would be the girl in the room that I never stood up. I just heard the comments, and I heard people talking about Latinos, and heard people commenting about immigration, and I never said anything. So, so now I'm saying something, and what I say is, I'm going to be the jerk in the room that says something and makes everybody feel uncomfortable. And so I don't really think about fear. My life is a fearless expression because I'm concerned about that hate, but then also the hate for my own community. But I don't care. And so I just decided to be the jerk in the room, I guess is how I would answer that.
I think that's social
wonderful.
change, though. That's it, right?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Elsie, I want to ask you, you have talked about something that's also been in the news recently, which is President Obama endorsing efforts to ban conversion therapy in this country. You experienced such therapy. Tell us about it and what you think of the effort to ban it.
Well, this was a lifetime ago, at least it feels this way. I was a youth minister in a church. I was married. I was in undergrad, and I really was serious about my faith and about religion. And even though I was cognizant of my same-sex attractions, you know, they teach you that if you just pray hard enough, if you just fast long enough, God will take it away, pray the gay away. So I was on the path to pray the gay away, and I went into my boss's office, and I told him I was wrestling with this demon, and I needed help, and so he recommended this program. And I would tell you, you know, looking back, I mean, I can laugh about it now, you know, because it's really funny. I don't like to subscribe to, you know, stereotypical images of what it means to be anything, but if you had to do it a stereotypical gay person, it was the person who was teaching the Exodus course. I was sitting here and I thought I was taking crazy pills because it was quite literally one of the most effeminate human beings I'd ever, male or female, I've ever seen in my life, telling me that I can man up and I too can be straight like him. And I'm looking and I'm like, is everybody okay with this? But I was 21, 22. I was desperate to stay in the ministry, and I really, really wanted to fit in what I thought it would have meant to be a Christian based upon their interpretation of such. And so I went through with it, and it was really, really painful and harmful. And talking about being the jerk in the room, one of the things that I loved since coming out is being that person for the LGBT community, saying, you know, that's not okay, saying maybe you should consider this, saying you should not be considering that. And so I applaud the president for talking about the harm and the junk science, if you will, of this, and using your faith to mask your hatred or your discomfort isn't truly faith. And it's certainly in the Christian faith isn't what Jesus taught. But it took me a while to get to that place, for sure.
Quick follow-up before I go to Linda. Do you think President Obama's early either reluctance or political calculations about evolving on gay rights will mar his legacy in the long term as a civil rights leader on that issue?
Absolutely not. Forgive me if anyone is offended, but we're like in the Ronald Reagan building, right? And when you think about all the atrocities...
He got 26% of the gay vote.
When you think about all the atrocities and the scandals that happened during his administration, and yet with a little bit of time, things get, a little bit more shinier, it's hard for me to imagine, especially when it's been reported that he came out in favor of same-sex marriages as far back as the 90s in Chicago. It's hard for me to imagine people 20 years from now going, yeah, but he hesitated. I think we'll remember the fact that when the tide turned in this conversation, very much in the way we remember JFK and Lyndon Johnson, that this president was the acting and sitting president when this change with LGBT issues shifted in the country.
Linda, a funny thing happened to you when you wrote this article that has now been read 6 million times, we've heard, that really made you someone people wanted to hear from on this issue, that allowed you to then presumably write a book and gain a platform to talk about these issues. And that success has taken you into a world, maybe a little bit like this room, and many rooms like this, where you see the people who have been, as you say, making the policies that resulted in the life you'd been living. What have you learned about these rooms that you've now entered, and what has surprised you in that education?
First and foremost, that it's incredibly, not to use the word incorrectly, it's incredibly rich to see a bunch of fairly wealthy people doing meetings and then accusing me of being lazy. Just the amount of time that you guys spend saying the same things over and over to each other, it's incredible. I think that
so much nervous laughter right now.
Hey, it's all of our jobs to be the jerk in the room.
That's actually the name of this panel.
That jerks in a room. Jerks in a room. Yeah. I think the thing that I've learned is that I used to think it was malevolent. I used to think that folks who could not see what reality was for more than 45 million Americans living under the poverty line, for nearly 2/3 of Americans that are paycheck to paycheck, that have no savings. How do you run that country and not see what you are creating? It must be spite. And what I've realized is it's not spite, it's institutional intransigence. It's people that are in calcified rules, and we'd like to change this policy or this program, but we just couldn't get that past finance because, whatever. It's a lot of want and will and effort without the tools to make those changes. And so I think what I've realized is everybody feels as powerless as everybody else. It's just some people get really comfy pillows and good liquor.
Where's this liquor located?
Exactly.
Dude, I know.
Everybody will need it after this. So
Yeah, listen.
Thought this was
will be
vodka.
provided.
Yeah, right? Where's my Jameson?
So I'm going to now go, as we wrap up, go down the line the opposite way, starting with Hua. And as we reflect, there are folks in this room, folks watching this on some stream or TV box maybe even, who can do things. Particularly if we follow Linda's suggestion that this is not always spite, but people not knowing enough or institutions being sclerotic. If you could speak to, and maybe you are speaking to, people who could actually fundamentally change their worldview enough to make America a little more just, a little more humane, what's the thing you'd ask them to think about? Wow.
Wow. I don't know. I guess one thing that struck me the past day and a half is there's been a lot of conversation about sort of efficiency and rationalization of society. And I think what draws me to culture and art is the contradiction. It's the sort of desire to demand more of the world. So I don't know. I mean, I guess just listen to the Kendrick Lamar album or something like, just indulge some sort of contradiction in your life artistically and see what happens. But I'll just leave it at that vague note.
Denise.
So my world is about telling stories, and I think a lot of healing and a lot of connection and a lot of letting go of assumptions happen when someone is curious about someone's story, really listens and internalizes someone else's story and reflects on their own life and where they're similar versus, and where they're different, but where they're similar. I think what I'd like to see is a world that's more curious and asking people how to pronounce their name and pronouncing it correctly and acknowledging a history is a great place to start too.
I think if you are a mayor or a city council person and you have not had a conversation with your police department after the past year about racial profiling, about practices with your police, you are doing your community a grave disservice. I have had the privilege or non-privilege of covering Ferguson, Eric Grand, Trayvon Martin, goes on and on for CNN. And I'm so sick and tired of mayors after the fact telling us that they're going to, get this right. And that the victories are justice for people who are now dead. The victory needs to be about these sort of crimes and murders not happening in the first place. The victories need to be an ongoing dialogue with the community before a tragedy happens, before an injustice happens, not afterwards. And so if you're not being proactive right now and you're a political figure, a municipal political figure in this country, you are doing your community a grave disservice.
Thank you. Linda.
Listen to yourselves. We here talk about human capital as though I'm worth some more now than I was a year and a half ago, or have gained any intelligence or strength or articulation or talent. I was working in an IHOP. I was just as smart as I am now, hell, probably smarter, because then I was balancing 3 jobs, and the logistics alone will kill you. Listen to yourselves talk about human capital. Listen to yourselves talk about worthwhile investments. Listen to yourselves talk about how to do things in a new way, and then don't have the meeting and go home and forget everything you just heard and discussed and talked about, because you are the people that actually can change the world. We're just the jerks in the room begging you to. So go and do.
Thank you very much.